Wel, diolch yn fawr iawn, Rhiannon. Ac diolch yn fawr i chi ddod fan hyn i fod gyda fi heno. Mae mor arbennig. A diolch o galon i Rhiannon a'r tîm ffantastig am gweithio mor galed i roi hwnna ymlaen. We didn't have the launch in Nanteos for obvious reasons, and what I didn't realise was actually how important it would have been for me to have that rite of passage. I feel there's unfinished business, and I feel I need this launch tonight in order to move on to my next project, a new novel with new characters, a century later than the 1750s in which these two novels are set. I didn't realise that was the case, but actually I need closure, and so thank you to all of you for coming here to provide closure for me as a writer, so now I can move on to my new project. It's a strange feeling, but it's very powerful. Rhiannon and I and the centre, hopefully, and all of us as a team, are going to do a lot of things together next year. All over this part of Wales, things are closing down, people are downsizing, people are losing staff, people are closing doors, people are only opening at weekends. But all the sheep are running in that direction, and for some reason, I don't quite know why we're doing it, but Rhiannon and I are running in that direction, and we're going to open it up and we're going to do lots of interesting things here about Welsh history, Welsh folklore, medieval history. We've got a project going with the Irish across the water there, which is called Celtic Routes, and we're going to be busy next year. We might be on our own here being busy, but we hope there'll be plenty of audience to join us, so please keep your eye and give your email to Rhiannon if you want to be on the mailing list. So in terms of books about Nanteos, Nanteos is really taking off. There's been a book recently by Ian Pegler, and it's for sale here tonight. Rhiannon stocks it, lots of people stock it, about the Nanteos Cup, known as the Holy Grail to some people. It's on display safely now in a glass cabinet in the National Library of Wales if you want to see it. All that's left after centuries of pilgrims have nibbled away at it and tried to ingest its wood, is something that you basically start a fire with, a little piece of wood held together with a couple of pins. But Nanteos really has inspired a lot of books, and I'm very pleased to say that the author of Nanteos, this is a factual book, Janet Joel, where are you, Janet? There she is at the back. Janet produced this book a year ago, Nanteos, Life on a Welsh Country Estate. Janet's family actually worked Nanteos for many centuries, and she's got photographs that I certainly haven't seen before. There's another major historian, I can't tell you his name, there's another major historian who's working on a new book about the Powell family, a factual book. I'm working on a new book as well. Something about Nanteos. Somebody was talking to me earlier, Elaine, and she's very aware of the spirits, and certainly Nanteos, I'm not allowed to say it's haunted. I've been bound over by the owner, but I can say it's haunting. It's a haunting place. So, so thank you very much for that. So, all of my books are available to be bought from the shop tonight. The Shadow of Nanteos needs reprinting again, so there's only 14 copies with Rhiannon tonight, but if you want to buy one, be one of those 14. So, why write another book about Nanteos? Well, this second book, The Dipping Pool, actually started off first, as things do with creative projects. They don't go in straight lines. They go round corners, they double back on themselves, they get stuck, and suddenly they've disappeared through portholes into another dimension. So you, as a writer, you think you're going in a straight line, and all of a sudden something shifts underneath you and you find, no, that's really what I'm interested in. So this book, Nanteos the Dipping Pool, actually started about 15 years ago. And it started with a woman and a baby and a river that I know very well. It's a river in the Cwmainion Valley, where my mum grew up, in the little village of Eglwys Fach, which is known as the R.S. Thomas village. And I swam in it as a child, as did my friend Helen, who's come up from Crickhowell. Thank you, Helen. And was never quite totally comfortable. It was cold. My mother used to tell me stories of the whirlpool and the Bugan and all these terrible things, and it stayed in my mind. And so the dipping pool is set in the Cumanion Valley. So between the two books, Shadow of Nanteos and the dipping pool, we range right from, there's a scene in Shadow of Nanteos in London, in a court case that happened in London as part of the Lead Wars, and we range right through southern Ceredigion, Llanbed Pont Steffan with the wicked, evil squire Sir Herbert Lloyd of Peterwell, and then we go right through in the dipping pool, right as far as we can go in Ceredigion. To the north of Ceredigion, there are a couple of scenes set in Machynlleth. So across the two books, really, we range through the whole of what Iolo Williams called, really, the last Welsh desert, the last wild Welsh place, the Cambrian Mountains, and what was known at the time in the 18th century as the Wild West of Wales. Not just because it was sparsely inhabited, as thank God it is today, sparsely inhabited, but because it was ruled over really by the gentry families who had a lot of power. They were a long way from London at the time, and each demancy really had a lot of power. They were holding the roles of justices of the peace. They were also lords of the manor, so they could impose fines as justices of the peace and collect the fines as lord of the manor. So it was a really great racket. I mean, we think we've got rackets going on today, and absolutely we do, but it wasn't a patch on what they were up to in the 18th century. So at the end of Shadow of Nanteos, I leave everybody on a cliffhanger. They're in a lot of trouble. All the characters are in a lot of trouble. And so it was an absolute gift then to write a sequel. So instead of giving myself an easy time and just picking it up and doing a chronological sequel, I found myself again picking up the difficult branch and taking the story as a prequel, and then it runs over the narrative arc of Shadow of Nanteos, and then it goes into a sort of postscript. So the Shadow of Nanteos basically deals with the people who live in Nanteos, the Powell family. The next book tells us their backstory. So we start the book 6 months before Shadow of Nanteos starts. Then we look at characters and events through other characters' eyes for a year and a half. And then we push the novel onwards for about 6 months, and we discover what happens to the people who was in such trouble and cliffhangers at the end of Shadow of Nanteos. We resolve their stories. So that was a hell of a bloody headache. And anybody who's read anything or tried to write anything or studied literature would know that it's not a good idea to write a prequel, a sequel, and a book that's from totally new characters' point of view that is a follow-on from your first book. So I was coming towards 2020, and I was like a spider with not enough arms. And I was working with Rhiannon, and she's a wonderful editor, and we were thrashing out the plots and the subplots, etc., and actually coming to some sort of sense in terms of all the plots. So I don't know any other writer who's written a book like that in structure, but I'd be very interested, maybe you do, it's probably not new, there is nothing new under the sun, but if you do know somebody whose sequel is a prequel and a sequel and from other points of view in the middle, tell me, because I'd like to read it and I'd like to actually send them a bottle of champagne. In terms of this book, the main characters in the second book, most of them have appeared briefly. They've put in a brief sort of cameo appearance in the first book, and quite often people have made those two links. So for instance, the main character in The Dipping Pool is called Branwen, and she's not named in the Shadow of Nanteos, but she does appear in one scene very briefly. It's a difficult appearance for her, but she appears in one scene. She's being ritually humiliated, and she is the main character of the next book. So the research for this has been long and hard, but very, very pleasurable. A couple of times it's been excruciating. For instance, the obstetric research. 18th century obstetrics, don't go there, not nice. Their use of animals, their propensity for hunting, their use of people. I've immersed myself for about 48 hours. It was a very tough one, reading actual first-hand accounts of Tyburn activities, hanging, burning, that sort of thing in the 18th century, because it becomes relevant towards the end of this book. So you have to enter the world in your imagination to have any hope whatsoever of then taking your readers with you. So it can be a little bit of a sort of baptism of fire as a person writing a book. If you can't go there yourself, you can't take your readers there. So yes, it can be quite an emotional journey and very satisfying and actually a little bit addictive. Even the unpleasant bits can be addictive. And of course, life in the 18th century, we're dealing with real people. There's a lot of history. There are letters. There's a wonderful archive kept in the National Library of Wales on the Powell family themselves, and some fantastic books about 18th century history in Cardiganshire. But there are very few novels set. It's like a wilderness. You have the great novels of Cordell and How Green Was My Valley in the south of Wales. In north of Wales, you've got wonderful classics, for instance, Tried Men Cyffion, Feet in Chains. But in this hinterland, it is like a desert in terms of fiction as well. So I'm hoping that across the two books, with careful research and creating characters, trying to bring them alive, that I've tried to at least start to fill that gap in Ceredigion. So this book starts again out on the mountains, the Cambrian mountains. And those of you who know the history of this area, there was what we call the Cardiganshire Lead Wars that really went on for about a century, from the 17th century into the 18th century. And it was basically a quite fight, and often violent and bloody fight, between the major gentry players in this area and the crown. And in this case, George II was on the throne at this point in history. And the book actually deals with the fact that although Nanteos was being built with the money by Mary Frederick at this point in time, Mary Frederick being a London heiress, she was the granddaughter of the Mayor of London, and she married Thomas Powell, and she brought her grand fortune, and what he did with it was build Nanteos with it. He then died, and he left no legitimate heir, although he left, as is rumoured, and there is some documentation to back up those rumours, he left an illegitimate son who was seen to be at the front of his mob. So things were so bad at times up in the mountains, fighting over the rights to the mines. Was it common land, in which case the crown got the silver, got the lead, or was it the property of Gogerthan or Peterwell or Nanteos or other landowners in the area, that the king actually had to send a party of Scots Greys armed to guard the mines. So all the history is there. It's fantastic really to read up on it, and it's fantastic to think of these people who were JPs, who wore fine clothes, who went to fine balls, who had their London houses, who held rank and responsibility. There were sometimes even MPs also taking people at pistol point, paying gangs and rampaging around the Cambrian mountains. So chapter 1, we return to those mountains, ravaged by lead, the remains still there. Far away to the west, the sun sets behind the bald hills below Devil's Bridge, the sky thin and purple as the skin under an old man's eye. The darkening land is pocked by lead and silver mines, even the horizon deformed by the lumps of waste and scarred by adits and trenches. It is Calan Mai, a spirit night, and many climb the mountain road at dusk. The foul weather of the last winter has ruined it, made great claw marks across the surface. Fast streams in flood, following wheel ruts downhill, have pulled away the stones, making the road almost impassable. No matter. The feet, nailed in leather clogs, or bare and strong, pass on. There is a hum bubbling up from the people. They clump together, then group split, teasing out like carded wool, then huddle again, all the time making a determined progress upwards. Sometimes distinct voices separate out, many are laughing, but as the front of the group turns the final corner, silence takes them. Directly ahead, and black, like a crucifix against the sky, is the tree of Sean y Gorf. Though it is now too dark to see details, the discoloured bone, the teeth, raw and intimate, the fetishes and charms of animal bone, feather, leather and glass that the people have hung around it to banish evil. The occasional glimpse of these as a torch catches them, the screech of the slowly swinging cage, and the memory of what is here are worse. One woman crosses herself, another puts an offering on the ground at the bottom of the scaffold and backs away. But they can see the great bonfires now, just make out the crowds surrounding them. With a new energy, they turn their backs on him and make their way towards the light. So at the beginning of The Shadow of Nanteos, it's William as a younger son and Elizabeth coming towards Nanteos to claim it as theirs. The older brother has died, and they find themselves suddenly in possession of this wonderful mansion that has not yet been finished. They have to finish the building of the mansion in order to take it over. And we see them at the beginning of The Shadow of Nanteos coming over the mountains, and it's autumn, it's about October, and they're coming towards the mountains ready to drop down, change in the lodge and transform into the owners of Plas Nanteos. Here at the beginning of the dipping pool, we see the people, the ordinary people who worked on the Nanteos estate, people like my family would have been. We have lead miners in our family. We lived more towards northern Cardiganshire, so our masters were Gogerthan, the prices of Gogerthan, rather than the pals of Nanteos. But it's my family story as well as the story of the people who were further south in Ceredigion. And I refer in both first chapters to the scaffold from which hangs, in the first book, you can't see exactly what's hanging on the scaffold, just see it almost like a cross against the sky. But from this point of view, we see right up close to the scaffold that we only saw in the distance in the first book. And what's hanging there is a man's skull in a cage. And this is actual research of a man from Delive in the 18th century. He was a smith, and he left his family to work in Delive mine, and he murdered his wife and he murdered his children and threw them down a deserted mine shaft. A lot of rubbish was put on the top. He thought he got away with it. A few years later, miners came to clear out the mine to see if there was anything left in there, if the water had drained away, and they found the corpses. And they traced it back to him, this man, and he was convicted. And because he was a smith, he was made to make his own headdress, and he was hung in his own headdress. And he was left there until his flesh rotted down and he became a skull. I'm sure this isn't suitable, is it, for a 3-year-old? But there we go, sorry. Sorry about that. Never come to your grandmother's book event. So again, this is real research that then I can use, happening to real people in Ceredigion. You, as a writer, I'm not doing careful research like Janet Joel, and actually, producing it straight on the page. I give it a little twist, add a little bit of chili, and out it goes. But interestingly enough, this skull was actually on display in Machynlleth in an apothecary shop, apparently, at the turn of the century. I don't know where it is now. I think it's reputed to be in a museum somewhere. So there are links between them. There are scenes that happen in Abati Ystrad Flir. Here's my son there, sorry. Abati Ystrad Flir. And of course the Stedmans were related to the Powells by marriage. And one story that says, explains how the Nanteos Cup came to the mansion was to pay a debt that the Stedman family owned to the Powells of Nanteos. And the sister of Thomas and William, the two gentry landowners in my books, was actually married first of all to Stedman at Mynachlog Fawr, the great farm there that so much interesting research and archaeology has been done in recent times. And that as part of that debt, the cup was given, like so many, a handful of beans in Jack and the Beanstalk. So scenes take place there in Abati Ystrad Flir, which is a fantastic place. Things take place on Cors Caron. Scenes take place in Tregaron themselves, the great horse fair, and scenes take place in Llanbadarn Church, in Aberystwyth, in the ruined castle where they would have had fair dancing and gone out there to celebrate, and they picnicked, and they were seeing ruins were, of course, a picturesque movement. Ruins were really coming into their own in people's imaginations at the beginning of this period. So it's 22. I have got a lot more to say. As my friends know, you can wind me up and I can talk for Wales or the UK or actually Europe itself. But I think I do need to stop because I think it would be nice if you had a chance to, if you want to buy anything or buy a book, a chance for me to sign it if you'd like me to. There are lots of scenes. I did a lot of research into folklore and folk practices with Welsh people in the 18th century, and they had a hell of a lot of fun. It seemed like it was a sort of riot going on. I mean, at the beginning of this book, I'm describing Calan Mai, which was the May festival, and they would have gone up into the hills with the bonfires, and there was a lot of dangerous, silly stuff like jumping over bonfires, sending your animals through bonfires, running around bonfires with various degrees of undress, throwing things into bonfires. There was a lot of throwing things into water, ducking yourself into the water. So all that research is fantastic, and it brings the people's lives to life. They weren't just sitting in their mud hovels, and they were made out of mud in those days. If we can imagine a mud hovel somewhere hot and baked, all right, maybe acceptable. Mud hovel in Ceredigion, not so pleasant. So it was also very interesting in terms of, this was where the great preachers, Howell Harris, Daniel Rowlands, William Williams, were practicing in Ceredigion. And it was a dangerous business for them because, as they said in their letters to each other, the gentry hunt us like partridges. So there's a lot of scenes here where the great preachers are preaching out on the mountains away from the town boundaries where they can't be found by the gentry, and baptising people in places like Cwmainion, in the rivers there, and in places where they could be left in peace by the people who owned the place and ruled it. So, diolch fawr iawn i chi gyd am ddod, a diolch i Rhiannon a'r tîm, a diolch i Eirian am y gwaith galed iawn. And most of all, thank you to you, because without readers, there's no books, and without an audience, there's no closure. So, diolch fawr iawn i chi, a os chi'n moyn prynu nhw, there are some copies. Please just go to the counter and buy them. There's some there, and I can sign them for you personally. And thank you, and safe journey back across the hellish marshes and the ridiculous roads. And that's what makes the place so fantastic. So, diolch fawr iawn i chi, a nos da. Tivo, come on. Diolch Rhiannon. That's lyfli. Yeah. Yeah.
Loads.